The first sound was not the girl's cry, but the groan of old wood giving way. For 10 years, Jedediah's porch had held nothing heavier than winter snow. Now it held a body. She was a tangle of torn calico and bruised skin, one hand still reaching for the door she hadn't the strength to knock on. He stood in the doorway, a ghost in his own home, the rifle in his hand feeling as cold and useless as his heart. He'd built this solitude board by board to keep the world out. But the world had just crawled to his doorstep, bleeding, and in her eyes, he saw a plea that was older than his own grief. His first instinct was an animal one. Close the door. Pretend she was a fallen deer, a trick of the failing light. This was not his fight. He'd had his fight, and he'd lost everyone who mattered. The wind bit at his face, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain, and for a moment it smelled like smoke, always the smoke. He looked down at the girl, no older than 12, her breath a shallow puff of white in the cold air. Leaving her meant a death sentence, delivered by the coming night if not by whatever she was running from. Bringing her in meant something worse. It meant letting the past in, with all its noise and its demands. He could feel the splinters of his carefully constructed peace digging into him. He'd come to this mountain to be forgotten, to let his name turn to rust, along with the hinges on his gate. But the girl's knuckles were scraped raw from crawling over the very rocks he called his fortress. She hadn't found a refuge. She'd found him. Jedediah cursed, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. It was a curse against God, against the girl, but mostly against himself. Because he knew, even as he fought it, that he was going to open the door wider. He knelt, the motion stiff and unfamiliar. His hands, calloused from chopping wood and tending his meager garden, were clumsy as he slipped one arm under her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. She weighed almost nothing, a bird with a broken wing. As he carried her over the threshold, away from the encroaching darkness, the cabin seemed to shrink around them. The silence he had cultivated for a decade was shattered not by a sound, but by a presence. He laid her on his own cot, the only soft place in the one-room cabin. And as he lit a lantern, the flickering light cast his shadow, huge and monstrous, on the wall behind her. A protector or a cage keeper? He didn't know which one he was anymore. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency that belonged to another life. He boiled water, tore strips from one of his own clean shirts, and gently washed the grime from her face and the cuts on her arms. Her skin was a road map of violence. There was a deep gash on her forehead, already swollen and bruised, and her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing the angry red mark of a man's handprint. Each injury he cleaned was a question he refused to ask. He found himself moving with a forgotten gentleness, his rough fingers tracing the line of a cut as if trying to understand its story. A flicker of memory, hot and sharp as a branding iron, seared through him. Another small hand, unhurt, clutching his finger. A little girl, with his eyes in her mother's laugh, her face lit by firelight. He shook his head, pushing the ghost away. That man was dead, buried under 10 years of silence and solitude. This was just a task, a problem to be solved. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were wide with a terror that went bone deep. She flinched away from his touch, scrambling backward on the cot until she hit the cold log wall. "Don't," she whispered, the word a ragged splinter of sound. He held up his hands, palms open, showing they were empty. He backed away slowly, giving her space. "Water," he said. His voice was gravelly from disuse. He gestured to the cup on the small crate beside the cot. She watched him, her gaze darting between his face and the door, calculating. He saw the mind working behind the fear. This was not a girl who had ever known safety. She was a survivor. He sat in his one wooden chair across the room, by the cold hearth, and waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind outside and the girl's shallow breathing. An hour passed. Then, too, he didn't move. Finally, her thirst won out over her fear. Her small hand trembled as she reached for the cup, never taking her eyes off him. She drank, the sound of her swallowing unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice low. She flinched, spilling a little water. "The ones you're running from." She shook her head, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. It was his blanket, and on her small frame, it looked like a shroud. "They'll find me," she said, her voice barely audible. "They find everyone. Not here," he said, the words tasting like a lie. He'd thought the same thing once. A week bled into the next, and a fragile rhythm formed in the space between heartbeats. He called her girl, and she called him nothing at all. They lived in a world of gestures and shared silence. He'd leave a plate of stew on the hearth, and she would eat it when he was outside, chopping wood. He'd watch from the corner of his eye as she explored the cabin, her fingers tracing the patterns in the wood grain of the table, the worn leather of his saddlebags. He saw her watching him too, her expression wary but with a flicker of something else, curiosity. One afternoon, he found her staring at the small, withered plant he kept on the windowsill. It was the only living thing he'd allowed himself to care for. "It's dying," she said. It was the first full sentence she'd offered freely. "Needs sun," he grunted, not looking at her. "It needs a bigger pot," she countered, her voice quiet but firm. "The roots are crowded." He stopped, axe mid-swing, and turned to look at her properly. She met his gaze for a second before looking away. The next day, he came back from checking his snares to find she had replanted the herb in an old tin can she'd found. She'd placed it in the one spot on the sill where the afternoon light lingered longest. He said nothing, but he started leaving a second cup of water by the sink each morning, a silent acknowledgement, a treaty. But the peace was as thin as morning ice. Every snapped twig in the forest, every shadow that danced at the edge of the clearing, was a threat. He took to sitting on the porch after she fell asleep, his rifle across his lap, watching the tree line. The mountain that had once been his sanctuary now felt like the wall of a closing fist. One evening, he saw it. 2 riders, silhouettes against the setting sun, moving slowly along the ridge opposite his valley. They were too far to see clearly, but they weren't hunters. They moved with the patient, methodical purpose of men searching for something, or someone. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones. They were casting a net, and his cabin was right in the middle of it. The world he had shut out was not just knocking anymore. It was preparing to break the door down. The girl was asleep inside, a faint wheeze in her breath. He looked at her through the window, then back at the riders on the ridge. He had brought her in to save her from the wilderness. Now, he realized he had only trapped her in it with him. They came 3 days later. Not the riders from the ridge, but 2 others. They were cut from a different cloth, hard-faced men, with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from being paid well for it. They rode right up to the cabin as if they owned it, their horses trampling the small patch of wild mint he'd let grow by the steps. Jedediah was on the porch, cleaning his rifle. He didn't stand. He just watched them, the cleaning cloth still in his hand, the rifle disassembled across his lap. It was a deliberate act. I am not a threat. I am just a man. The larger of the 2 men, a brute with a sun-scorched neck, dismounted. "Old man," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We're looking for something that got lost." He didn't look at Jedediah. his eyes scanning the cabin, the single window, the closed door. "Ain't nothing lost up here," Jedediah said, his voice even. "'Cept what wants to be." The second man, smaller and weaselly, stayed on his horse, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "We got word. A girl came through this way. Young, beat up pretty bad." Jedediah slowly, methodically, began reassembling his rifle. The click of the bolts sliding into place was the only sound. He didn't hurry. He let them watch. He let them see the familiarity in his hands. "Been alone up here 10 years, he said, not looking up. "Don't get many visitors. You're the first this season." The big man took a step closer. "Judge Merrick don't like his property going missing. He pays well for its return." Jedediah paused, looking up at him now. His eyes were flat, cold. "Then you best keep looking, 'cause all I got here is a cold hearth and a long memory. Neither is for sale." He could feel the girl's presence behind the door, could almost hear her heart hammering against her ribs. He was betting his life, and hers, on this bluff. The man stared at him, a long, assessing look. He was trying to weigh the truth, to smell the lie. He saw a gray-bearded hermit, weathered and worn. He saw a man with nothing to lose. What he didn't see was the fear churning in Jedediah's gut. Finally, the man grunted and turned away. "Wasting our time," he spat, swinging back onto his horse. "Let the mountain have him." They rode off without a backward glance. Jedediah didn't move until the sound of their hoofbeats had faded completely. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. The wood of the rifle stock was slick with sweat. He had bought them time. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they would be back. And next time, they wouldn't ask questions. That night, she told him, not all at once, but in broken pieces, huddled by the fire he'd finally built inside the hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the small cabin feel like the only safe place in the world. Her name was Lily. Her father had been a clerk for Judge Merrick, a man who owned the entire county, the law, the bank, the land. He was more king than judge. "My father." He kept a second ledger. She whispered, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "He wrote down everything, the real numbers, the names of the families the judge cheated, the land he stole." Jedediah listened, his face grim. This was worse than he'd imagined. This wasn't a runaway servant. This was a witness. "Merrick found out," she continued, her voice trembling. "They came to our house. It burned. The same word, the same story. Fire." He felt the phantom heat on his own skin. He didn't have to ask what happened to her father. He could see it in the haunted emptiness of her eyes. "Before they took him, he gave it to me. He told me to run, to take it to the marshals in the state capitol." From inside her worn dress, she pulled a small, oilskin-wrapped package. It was flat, no bigger than his hand. The ledger, the proof, the reason she was worth hunting, the reason her father was dead. She held it out to him. I don't know how to get there." Her composure finally broke, and a single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "I'm sorry I came here. I've brought his wrath to your door." Jedediah looked from the ledger in her small hand to the fire in the hearth. He could throw it in. In seconds, it would be ash. The proof would be gone. Merrick would have no reason to hunt her, no reason to bother with a broken old man on a mountain. They could disappear. She could heal. He could go back to his silence. It was the safe choice, the smart choice. But as he looked at her, shivering by the fire, he saw not just a hunted girl, but the embodiment of a promise. He saw the faces of every farmer and family the ledger represented. He saw her father's last, desperate act of defiance. And he saw, in the reflection of the flames in her eyes, the face of his own daughter. The life he had failed to protect. He had run from his fire once. He would not run from this one. He slowly reached out and took the package from her, his calloused fingers closing around it. It felt heavy. Heavy with the weight of the dead, the hopes of the living, and the burden of a choice. A choice he had already made. What would you do? Would you take the burden, knowing it could cost you everything you have left? He knew they couldn't stay. The cabin was a trap now. They needed supplies, a different horse, and information. That meant going to town. The town, Blackstone, sat in the valley, squarely under Judge Merrick's thumb. Going there was like walking into the wolf's den to ask for a bite to eat. There was only one person he could trust, maybe. Elias Thorne was the town's blacksmith, a man as solid and unyielding as the iron he worked. Years ago, before Jedediah had fled to the mountain, he and Elias had been friends. Elias knew what had happened to Jedediah's family, and he was one of the few who knew why Jedediah blamed himself. He left Lily hidden in a thicket at the edge of town, promising to be back before dusk. The town felt alien. The sounds, the smells, the people who averted their eyes as he passed, they all grated on his nerves. Judge Merrick's presence was everywhere, from the new sign on the bank to the watchful eyes of the sheriff, a man whose loyalty was bought and paid for. He found Elias in his smithy, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. The blacksmith didn't look up from the horseshoe he was hammering. The clang of metal on metal was a rhythmic, angry punctuation. "Shouldn't be here, Jed," Elias said, his voice low and tight. "He knows you're still up there." "I need help, Elias." Jedediah's voice was quiet. "Not for me." Elias finally stopped, plunging the glowing shoe into a barrel of water. It hissed, a plume of steam rising between them like a ghost. He turned, his face grim, his powerful arms slick with sweat. "It's the girl, isn't it? Word is out. Merrick's put a bounty on her head. $500. A fortune, enough to make any desperate man turn her in. She's just a child." "She's a threat to him," Elias corrected. "And anyone who helps her becomes one too. I have a family, Jedediah, a wife, 2 boys. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The family he had, the family Jedediah had lost. The blacksmith's eyes were full of a terrible, familiar conflict. The desire to do right versus the need to protect his own. It was a choice Jedediah understood too well. "I know," Jedediah said, his voice raw. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death." He didn't mention the ledger. He wouldn't put that burden on another man. For a long moment, Elias said nothing. He just stared at Jedediah, his face a mask of stone. Jedediah felt his hope dwindling. He had been wrong to come, wrong to ask. He turned to leave. "Wait," Elias said. He walked to the back of the smithy and returned with a heavy sack. "Food, a blanket, and this." He pressed a small, heavy pouch into Jedediah's hand. "Coins. There's a mare in the stable out back. She's old but sturdy. Take her. Follow the dry creek bed north. It'll shield you for a dozen miles. After that, you're on your own." It wasn't just help. It was a risk. A huge one. If Merrick found out, Elias would lose everything. "Why?" Jedediah asked. Elias looked past him, out the open door toward the town square. "Because my father was one of the names in a ledger just like the one she's carrying. Someone has to make a stand. I just pray to God it ain't the last one I ever make." The flight was a blur of exhaustion and fear. They traveled by night, hiding during the day. The sturdy mare Elias had given them a silent, tireless companion. The landscape shifted from the familiar pine forests to a harsh, open scrubland where the wind never stopped blowing. The sun beat down, and water became more precious than gold. Jedediah pushed them relentlessly, his fear a constant spur. He saw Merrick's riders in every dust devil, heard their voices in the howl of the wind. Lily, however, seemed to draw strength from the hardship. The farther they got from Blackstone, the more the fear in her eyes was replaced by a quiet resilience. She learned to read the sun, to find water where there seemed to be none. She never complained. She just watched him, absorbing everything. One night, as they huddled behind a rock outcropping, sharing a cold piece of dried meat, she spoke. "You're not just a hermit, are you?" she asked. He looked at her, surprised by the directness of the question. "What do you mean?" "The way you move, the way you watch everything, the way you handled those men at the cabin. You were a lawman, weren't you?" He didn't answer. He just stared into the darkness, but she had seen the truth in his silence. He had worn a badge once. He had believed in the law, until the law, in the form of a corrupt sheriff and a rigged jury, had failed him, until fire had taken everything and the law had called it an accident. He had been a man who hunted others. Now he was the one being hunted. Their bond, forged in silence and shared danger, deepened. He taught her how to handle a knife, how to start a fire with flint and steel. She, in turn, reminded him of what it was to care for someone other than himself. Her presence was a constant, quiet reproach to the lonely man he had become. One afternoon, sheltering from a dust storm in a shallow cave, she found him staring at a worn silver locket he kept in his pocket. He rarely looked at it. "Who was she?" Lily asked gently. He opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of a woman with a kind smile and a little girl with bright, laughing eyes. "My wife, Sarah," he said, his voice thick, "and my daughter, Anna." "She's beautiful," Lily whispered, looking at the tiny face of the girl. "She looks like you." Jedediah's hand trembled as he closed the locket. "The fire. It wasn't an accident. It was men like Merrick. I went after them. I was a deputy. They got to me through my family." He had never spoken these words aloud. They felt like stones in his mouth. "I wasn't there," he choked out. "I was chasing a ghost, and the real monster was at my door." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a decade of unshed tears. "I failed them, Lily." He expected her to recoil, to see him as the failure he was. Instead, she reached out and placed her small, chapped hand on his arm. "You're not failing me," she said. Their luck ran out in a narrow canyon, 3 days shy of the state line. A rock slide, perhaps natural, perhaps not, had blocked the way forward. As they turned back, they saw them. Merrick himself, flanked by a half-dozen of his riders, blocking the canyon mouth. There was no escape. Merrick was a surprise. He wasn't a grizzled outlaw. He was a man in a fine coat, his face smooth and unlined, his eyes holding a placid, reptilian coldness. He sat on his horse as if it were a throne. "Jedediah," he said, his voice calm, conversational. "I remember you, the deputy with a temper, a shame about your family." The casual cruelty of it was a physical blow. Jedediah pushed Lily behind him, his own body a shield. "The ledger, old man," Merrick said, extending a gloved hand. "Give it to me, and I'll let the girl walk away. My business is with the paper, not with her." It was a lie. Everyone there knew it was a lie. Lily knew it. Merrick knew it. Jedediah knew it. This was the moment he had been running from for 10 years. The fire, the helplessness, the failure. It all came rushing back, a roar in his ears. He could see Anna's face in the flames, hear Sarah's cry. His past was standing right in front of him, wearing a fine coat and a patient smile. "I wasn't there!" his mind screamed. He felt the old, familiar despair begin to wash over him. It was happening again. Another child he couldn't protect, another monster he couldn't defeat. He looked at Lily, whose small hand was gripping the back of his shirt. Her knuckles were white, but her eyes, when they met his, were not filled with terror, they were filled with trust. She wasn't his past, she was his present. And in that instant, something shifted inside him. The guilt that had haunted him for a decade didn't vanish, but it settled. It became fuel. He was not the man who had lost everything. He was the man who had something to protect. He looked at Merrick, and for the first time, he didn't see a ghost from his past. He saw just a man. A greedy, cruel man who was standing in his way. "You want it?" Jedediah said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You'll have to come and get it." It was a fool's choice, a suicidal stand, but it was his. He didn't wait for them to charge. He fired first, not at Merrick, but at a loose rock formation on the canyon wall above them. The shot echoed like thunder, and a shower of rock and shale rained down, forcing the riders' horses to panic. It wasn't much, but it was chaos. "Run!" he yelled to Lily, shoving her toward a narrow crevice in the canyon wall he'd spotted earlier. "Don't stop!" He didn't watch to see if she obeyed. He trusted that she would. He was no longer a lawman fighting for justice. He was a creature of the wilderness, using the terrain he knew as his only weapon. He scrambled up the rocks, moving with an agility that belied his age, firing sparingly, making every shot count. He wasn't trying to kill them all. He was trying to buy time. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his coat. Another kicked up dust by his feet. He was outmanned, outgunned, and running out of time. Merrick's men were fanning out, their professionalism returning as their horses settled. They were hunters, and he was the cornered prey. He found cover behind a large boulder, reloading his rifle with shaking hands. This was it, the end of the line. He thought of Elias, the blacksmith, who had risked everything. He thought of Lily's father, who had died for that ledger. He thought of Sarah and Anna, waiting for him on the other side of a fire he could never extinguish. He wasn't just fighting for Lily anymore. He was fighting for all of them, for the man he used to be, for a final, clean act in a life that had become messy and stained. The big man from the cabin was the first to find him. He came around the boulder, a grin on his face, his pistol raised. Jedediah didn't have time to lift his rifle. He lunged, driving his shoulder into the man's gut. They tumbled together, a desperate, grunting struggle. The man was stronger, but Jedediah was fueled by a pure, cold rage. His hand found a loose rock, and he brought it down, once, twice. It was ugly, brutal, and necessary. He scrambled back, grabbing his rifle, just as two more riders appeared. But then, a shot rang out from a different direction. One of the riders cried out and fell from his saddle. Jedediah looked up, confused. On the ridge above, a figure stood silhouetted against the sky. Elias, the blacksmith, had followed them. He held a long-range hunting rifle, his stance as solid as the mountain itself. Merrick, seeing the fight turn, spurred his horse directly toward Jedediah, his face a mask of fury. This was personal now. As Merrick charged, pistol raised, Jedediah stood his ground. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and saw not the judge, but the fire. This time he would not look away. This time he would not fail. He fired. The world went silent. Merrick lay in the dust, his fine coat stained with the red earth. His remaining men, their leader gone, their confidence shattered by the unseen riflemen on the ridge, hesitated. Then they broke and fled. Jedediah stood there, the rifle smoke curling around him, the silence of the canyon ringing in his ears. He was breathing hard, his body screaming with pain and exhaustion, but he was standing. Elias was gone from the ridge as quickly as he had appeared, a guardian angel who had repaid an old debt and vanished back into the world. Slowly, Jedediah made his way to where he had sent Lily. He found her huddled in the crevice, her face pale, her eyes wide. In her hand, she still clutched the oilskin package. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist and burying her face in his worn coat. He stood stiffly for a moment, the embrace so foreign it was almost painful. Then, slowly, his hand came up and rested on her head. The ledger made it to the state capitol. The story it told unraveled Judge Merrick's empire of fear, returning stolen land and stolen futures to the people of the valley. Elias the blacksmith became a town elder, a man respected for a quiet act of courage no one could ever prove. They never went back. Jedediah and Lily pointed themselves west, toward a horizon that promised nothing but distance. They bought a small plot of land in a place where no one knew their names, a place with green grass and a clear running stream. Their new cabin was small, but the porch was sturdy, built to hold the weight of 2 chairs. The silence returned, but it was a different kind now. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, filled not with ghosts, but with the small sounds of a life being rebuilt. The sound of Lily humming as she tended a small garden. The sound of Jedediah whittling a piece of wood on the porch. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that looked nothing like fire, Lily came and sat beside him. She handed him a cup of water. He took it, their fingers brushing. He looked out at the vast open land before them. The world was still a hard place, full of shadows. But here, in this small pocket of peace, a man who had lost his family and a girl who had lost hers had found something like it in each other. He was no longer a ghost in his own home. He was just a man, sitting on his porch, watching his daughter grow.